This time it's 5 of the coolest desert racers. For Americans, the Desert Racer is an iconic piece of motorcycling history at its peak during the 1960s and into the 1970s. But during this period the sport was little known in Europe and Great Britain, but the release of On Any Sunday brought the sport to a wider audience and ensured that it would be forever associated with the king of cool, Steve McQueen. And so here are 5 cool desert race or desert race inspired motorcycles of the 1960s and 70s. Husqvarna. Husqvarna's motocross machines are used very prominently in On Any Sunday by Steve McQueen and a number of other riders, and indeed the early 70s was a golden age for Husqvarna's motocross success. But of course the company dates back rather further than that, being founded in the town of Husqvarna in Sweden in 1689, originally as a manufacturer of muskets, but followed the pattern of so many other firearms manufacturers when they began bicycle production at the end of the 19th century. Eventually moving into motorcycle production in 1903. From 1920 onwards the company produced its own power units. The most popular early unit was a 50-degree side valve V-twin of 550cc, and they would go on to campaign overhead valve versions of this engine in the 1930s in the Grand Prix circuit in both the 500 and the 350cc class. The company would become involved in motocross during the 1950s, initially with 4-stroke singles before later developing their own 2-stroke engine, and the machines would become a dominant force in motocross and other events during the 1970s, winning 14 world motocross titles across all capacities, as well as 24 Enduro World Championships and clocking up 11 Baja 1000 victories, including their first with J.N. Roberts and Malcolm Smith in 1967. Perhaps Husqvarna's most iconic machine of this era was their 400 Cross. Introduced in 1969, this ran a 396cc 2-stroke single-cylinder engine with a bore and stroke of 81 by 76mm. Peak power was 40 horsepower and this was fed through a 4-speed gearbox. And typical for the bike of the period, it ran fairly modest drum brakes front and rear, but thankfully only had 105 kilos or 231 pounds to bring to a stop. Husqvarna 400 had a fearsome reputation, and with its beautiful red paint job was one of the coolest off-roaders of its time. The Triumph TR6 Trophy. Triumph's 650cc TR6 Trophy replaced an earlier 500 model and was introduced in 1956. The machine was developed for use in the International 6-day trial, and in 1964 was used by the US team, including one Steve McQueen, and his well-known fondness for the machine would boost sales in the United States, where the trophy would prove just as popular in sales terms as the iconic Bonneville. And in the States, the TR6C, the competition variant, will be affectionately known as the Desert Sled, and this is indeed highly appropriate. The machine was very successful off-road and had been developed specifically with the US market in mind, where the importers had requested a larger version of the TR5 Trophy. The engine was based on the Tiger 110 model and was of 649cc with a bore and stroke of 71 by 82. Early machines ran a compression ratio of 8.5 to 1 and had a peak power of 42 horsepower. On the C model this would later be increased of course. But unlike the Tiger 110, the machine sported a Siamese exhaust which ran high up on the left hand side of the machine. And in another nod to the bike's competition orientation, both the headlamp and the rear wheel were quickly detachable. The machine would remain virtually unchanged until 1963, when the whole range was converted over to unit construction. This would also see the adoption of battery coil ignition replacing the original magneto, not a move seen as particularly desirable at the time. By the mid-60s the machine was becoming eclipsed by the oncoming 2-strokes, but in sales terms at least the machine did remain popular. 1966 would see a move to 12-volt electrical systems, and the following season would see a raise of compression to 9 to 1, and the Bonneville exhaust valves and camshafts were also adopted, giving an extra 5 horsepower claimed. This machine would continue through until 1971 and the introduction of the motocross-inspired oil-bearing frame. And indeed these later machines are somewhat underrated, featuring the excellent chassis and 5 speeds from 72 onwards. the BSA Firebird. BSA's unit construction machines have never had the cachet value of their Triumph equivalents, and have never been seen as quite as cool. But despite this, the machines were very successful in AMA events during their time, and there's no doubt that their equivalent to the TR6 Desert Sled, the Firebird, is a very handsome machine indeed. The Firebird ran the 654cc A65 engine, which had a bore and stroke of 75 by 74. The first of the unit construction competition machines was known as the Spitfire Hornet, and this was introduced to replace the earlier Spitfire Scrambler, which had used an A10 base engine. Although later in the 60s the name would be abbreviated to just plain Hornet. But in 68 the Hornet name was phased out to be replaced by the all-new Firebird Scrambler. This beautiful machine featured a 49 horsepower version of the engine and had twin high-mounted exhausts. There was the usual BSA 4-speed gearbox, and the bike weighed in at 184 kilos or 406 pounds. And while the European market version of the bike featured an 18 litre fuel tank, for the US version it was just 9 litres or 2.4 US gallons. But unfortunately the bike was never a great sales success in the US market. Its high price of over $1,300 at the time was a little too rich for the average US collegiate student. Very late models will see the adoption of the oil-bearing frame, and these are very handsome machines indeed, with a fine off-road capable chassis and 54 horsepower claimed peak power. The Norton 600 Nomad and P11 750 Ranger. The late 50s and early 60s would see Norton, or more specifically their parent company AMC, with a couple of major problems. Firstly, the vast majority of the company's sales were to the UK market, AMC having nothing like the presence in the US market that competitors BSA Triumph did. And this was a problem because the UK motorcycle market in the late 50s and early 60s was contracting rapidly. Simply put, sales of motorcycles of all types and makes had tanked. And if you're AMC and you sell the bulk of your machines to older riders in the UK market, and the bulk of those older riders have suddenly moved on to small cars, you've got a major problem. Well then, let's try and sell more bikes in America would seem the obvious solution. And here we come to problem number 2. Norton's chassis, the fabled mechanless featherbed frame, which would influence the design of both European and Japanese chassis well into the 1970s, was completely unsuitable for off-road use. It was too wide, too low, and really not up to the job of holding a bike together when it's been bashed around off-road. And this is fair enough. After all, you wouldn't take a Yamaha R6 off-road unless you were a complete loony, of course. But fortunately there is a simple and elegant solution. The AMC frame, designed for use on AGS and matchless machines, was much more capable off-road and far better suited to the role. And so hey presto, bung a Dominator 99600cc engine into that frame and you've got an instant off-roader. And thus in 1958 was created the Norton Nomad. And so with AMC in dire trouble by the mid-60s, it seemed obvious to do the same thing again, but this time using Norton's mighty Atlas 750 engine to create the P11 Ranger. P11 used the 745cc engine from the Atlas, with a bore and stroke of 73 by 89. Compression ratio was 7.3 to 1, and there was a claimed 54 horsepower produced, and the transmission was an AMC 4-speed unit. And this all went together to create a truly mighty beast of a motorcycle. And whilst it could be described as a parts bin special, you could also describe it as one of the earliest adventure bikes available. Because these days, while we often see the BMW GS as the first big adventure bike, machines like this were around long before. Honda CL360. Okay, so a fair copy of the CL360 isn't exactly a desert sled, and in fact it's more like the modern CB500X in that it's a road bike with off-road styling, a soft roader if you will. But that's not to say the bike isn't capable of hitting the trails, it most certainly is. Like most machines of its period, it's a great all-rounder. And true, while it was never going to win the Baja 1000, it did at least look the part, and for many, that's all that really counts. And there's no doubt that with the gold paint job and those lovely high-level exhausts, Honda did a great job on the styling. The engine used came straight from the CB or CD range and was a 4-stroke single overhead cam parallel twin with a capacity of 357 cc's with a bore and stroke of 67 by 50. Compression ratio was 9.3 to 1 and peak power was a claimed 34 horsepower at 9,500 rpm. There was a 6-speed transmission and the bike weighed in at 178 kilos or 392 pounds. So not exactly a lightweight given the capacity. The machine was of course a development of the earlier 350 model, but with a redesigned top end aimed at curing the early camshaft wear problems on the 350. And while the 350 was more powerful, the 360 had better torque and was generally more reliable. But despite being outgunned by the two-stroke opposition, the 360 would remain popular throughout its production run. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us do a future video on? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.